There is a mysterious cycle in human events. To some generations, much is given. Of other generations, much is expected. This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny.
A rendezvous with destiny. As the New Deal's 100 days drew to a close, the destiny of the people in the relief lines was still uncertain. On one hand, there was the hope that FDR's programs would lift the nation out of the Depression and restore prosperity. On the other hand, there was the fear that perhaps there was no solution, and that America would never again realize the prosperity it once had. Uncertainty, conflict, and desperation. These were the themes that dominated the fall of 1933 as the 30s, the lean years, progressed. Hopefully, the seeds of recovery had been planted during the 100 days. Now, the nation waited to see if those seeds would bear fruit. But it didn't wait quietly. Roosevelt's innovative approach to government had upset the American social and political balance. The imbalance led to a backlash. Conservatives and traditionalists resented the New Deal and saw in its philosophy of big government, public works, and unbalanced budgets a threat far worse than the Depression. Although Roosevelt was loved and admired by millions of Americans, Americans whose homes he had saved from foreclosures, who received federal assistance, and who, for the first time in years, had hope for jobs, he also was vilified and disliked by critics who rejected his philosophy of government, his economic ideas, and his methods of carrying them out. FDR himself walked a thin line, trying to restore the economy while maintaining social peace. His goal was the public good, a point he repeated over and over again, especially in his famous fireside chat radio speeches.
Each of our steps has a definite relationship to every other step. More and more people are considering the whole. They know that the process of the constructive rebuilding of America cannot be done in a day or a year.
And recovery wasn't coming in a year. Although the legislation of the 100 days began the process, it wasn't enough. Things weren't getting worse, but they weren't getting better fast enough. New measures were needed, and FDR provided them. Harry Hopkins, FDR's special assistant, was put in charge of the Works Progress Administration. The WPA, as it was called, was another major attempt to create millions of new jobs immediately. The results were astounding. WPA projects accounted for the construction of nearly 6,000 schools, 2,000 hospitals, 1,000 airports, and 13,000 playgrounds. Special WPA projects provided for the employment of artists and writers who decorated public buildings and wrote plays and novels reflecting a new social consciousness. But economic programs weren't FDR's sole concern. He was also committed to introducing programs to aid those neglected by the mainstream. The Social Security Act of 1935 to protect workers by insurance for unemployment and old age was a milestone in social legislation. Roosevelt's brain trust and cabinet, including Frances Perkins, Secretary of Labor, and the first woman to hold a cabinet post, worked long and hard exploring innovative ideas. But social and economic programs and actions had not turned the tide as 1934 began. By then, 5 million Americans had found work, and the gross national product had increased by half. But 10 million people were out of work, and national income was still little more than it was in 1929. Mary Crawford remembers the hard times.
Oh, yeah, I was the only one working in the house, and that was during the time of the NRA wages. And you were very, very lucky to get $15 a week. You were a favorite son or daughter. There were many, many people waiting in line for the job.
And Helen Hall of New York recalls,
we did a study of 11 blocks here on Henry Street. 50% of the wage earners were out of work.
throughout 1934, the economic woes remained chronic. But in that year also, it seemed as if nature had joined with the economy to confound recovery attempts. On the Great Plains, America's breadbasket, years of poor farming practices finally took their toll. 1934 was the year of the dust storms, the terrible, relentless storms, which literally blew away acres of irreplaceable topsoil. These dust storms reached catastrophic proportions, turning much of the plains into a vast dust bowl, transforming what was once the richest farmland in the world into a desert. The soil had simply worn out. Dried by drought, it was turned to dust and swept away when the plains winds began to blow. One eyewitness remembers.
First of all, you're out in the Great Plains. When a storm comes up on the Great Plains, you see it coming. You can see it coming for miles. And then this impending sense of disaster and doom hits you. Finally, you're in the middle of it. There's nothing to break the force of the wind. And that's when it's really bad. The soil gets lifted up and begins to blow. The sand and dry soil drives against you. It gets into everything. This fine powder sifts into everything.
And there was nothing at all that could be done about it. Thousands of farmers watched their farms and homes blow away. Then they, too, left the dead land to try their luck elsewhere. Families from Oklahoma, Arkansas, and other states gathered together whatever they could load onto a truck or automobile and set off on one of the greatest migrations in American history. Many headed for California, as if it were the answer to their dreams. But when they arrived, their nightmare continued. There was no work, nor was there land to farm. Many migrants set off anew on the frustrating search for a better way of life. To forestall such a tragedy from ever again happening, the government passed laws to implement sound agricultural and conservation practices on the plains. In a large measure, these reforms, including the Soil Conservation Act of 1935, were successful, and today account for the fertility of much of the Great Plains. The dust storms were a natural catastrophe, but in 1935, FDR also faced growing political problems. The Supreme Court ruled that the NRA was unconstitutional, thus voiding a mainstay of FDR's industrial program. One important idea in the NRA was quickly reborn. Congress passed the famous National Labor Relations Act, often called the Wagner Act, after one of its sponsors. Workers hailed the Wagner Act as the Magna Carta of labor. The act created the National Labor Relations Board, which ensured fair and open bargaining between labor and management. It recognized labor's growing demand for an increased voice in industrial matters and helped boost the growing union movement. The growth of unions, such as the AFL, the CIO, the United Mine Workers, the United Auto Workers, and the International Longshoremen's Association, meant that labor had finally arrived as a power to be respected. But the battle for union recognition wasn't an easy one. Massive strikes were commonplace. New tactics were introduced, such as the sit-down strike, where striking workers refused to leave the plants and factories. Violence was also all too common. FDR refused to send in federal troops to break strikes. He made it very clear that the government would be a referee in labor disputes, not an ally of big business. In some areas, then, advances were made, while in others, there were setbacks. Economic health was slowly being restored. But underlying the progress was always the threat of chaos. Communism became, or was thought to be, a major element in the growing labor movement. While on the right, rabble-rousers like Father Coughlin, the radio priest, preached a brand of bigoted, anti-Semitic Americanism. Other prophets of a new America surfaced over specific controversies. Evangelist Billy Sunday, for instance, swayed millions with his impassioned demands for continued prohibition, even after prohibition was repealed. Another influential voice of the lean years was Senator Huey Long of Louisiana. Called the Kingfish, Long gained considerable support with a fanciful brand of populism which called for sharing the national wealth.
The bank accounts show that 1/150th part of the people own 2/3 of all the money that's in the bank. The only way by which we can ever bring this country out is to redistribute the wealth.
Long's Share the Wealth program, however, was ended by his assassination in 1935. But the rise of people like Huey Long clearly demonstrated that the American people were still uncertain and confused, at odds with the way things were going. After years of depression and years of experimentation, enough recovery had taken place to motivate people to look for a sense of stability, to enjoy some of the fruits of the new prosperity, slight as it was. Sensing this, Roosevelt declared a cooling-off period in 1936, a rest period to maintain social peace and to placate opponents of the New Deal, as another presidential election loomed. Governor Alf Landon of Kansas was the Republican nominee, running on a platform that promised to keep some New Deal measures and to balance the budget. Fashioning a coalition of organized labor, minorities, working-class urbanites, small farmers, and Southerners, Roosevelt emerged from the election with one of the largest victories in American history. He quickly set the tone of his second administration, a continuation of the programs and goals of the first.
In this nation, I see tens of millions of its citizens, a substantial part of its whole population, who at this very moment are denied the greater part of what the very lowest standards of today call the necessities of life. I see 1/3 of a nation ill housed, ill clad, ill nourished.
But in spite of his large victory, Roosevelt found himself facing increasing opposition as many Americans thought the crisis had passed and the road to victory was assured. The Supreme Court controversy was a case in point. FDR, annoyed that the court had declared a number of his programs unconstitutional, decided to change the court's makeup and increase the number of justices, appointing new members who would support him. However, this court-packing tactic was universally rejected, even by his most ardent supporters. It was a major defeat. But worse was yet to come. In 1937, business slumped again. The nation, just barely getting back on its feet, was hit by a recession. Unemployment was rising. Factories were closing down. It began to look as if the gains of the past 4 years had been lost. Roosevelt began once again to prime the economic pump by increasing government lending and spending. As months passed, the downward spiral of the recession had been reversed. By the end of 1938, the nation's economic machinery was once again picking up speed. Meanwhile, public and government attention focused on gathering war clouds in Europe. In the 30s, Hitler had come to power in Germany. Mussolini had control of Italy, and a militaristic Japan had invaded China. President Roosevelt took a firm stand against these foes of Western democracy.
When an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins in a quarantine of the patients in order to protect the health of the community against the spread of the disease.
In this effort, he was opposed by many Americans, including the respected Charles Lindbergh, who believed in an isolationist policy of America first. Unable to take direct action against fascism, Roosevelt, however, was able to place America's industrial resources at the disposal of the democracies. When war broke out in Europe, the United States became once more the free world's arsenal of democracy and food supplier, and the nation prospered. Americans' faith in President Roosevelt as a result of the economic recovery led him to run for and win an unprecedented third term as president in 1940.
Today, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The bombs that fell on Pearl Harbor ushered America into World War II and marked the end of the lean years. The 30s marked a period of great reform in American history and a turning point in the 20th century. Prior to the 30s, the role of the federal government in society was kept to a minimum. The New Deal introduced new concepts about government's role in society. Most of the social legislation that we have today comes from government's response to people's desperation during the lean years. America is a society in constant flux, with its laws and programs constantly being re-examined and re-evaluated, along with the role of government in society. But certainly few would question that the concept of government response to aid citizens in extreme and dire circumstances is an established precedent, and many believe an obligation. The changes that took place during the lean years of the 30s continue to influence our lives today.